Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have another great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it on demand. Following today's presentation, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to get you to that webinar right on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for any of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we'll get to as many audience questions as we can before the end of today's presentation. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So stick around, hopefully you'll be one of our 3 lucky random winners. Okay, with that, we will go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is DataOps, DevOps, and the developer, treating database code just like app code. Our speakers today are no strangers to the DevOps environment and community, and they are Stephen O'Grady, who is principal analyst and co-founder at RedMonk, Adam Bowen, who is with the Office of CTO at Delphix, and Robert Reeves, who is co-founder and CTO at Datacol. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Hey, Adam, Stephen, you guys want to say hi?
Sure. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Well, guys,
Robert, I'm going to just going to turn it over to you. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you so much. So folks, thank you for joining us. Look, we've got, we're going to be talking about how the database fits into DevOps, its impact on the developer, and what developers can do to, well, in effect, be masters of their own destiny. We're moving to a world where you build it, you run it, and that must include the data store. We have to persist that data somewhere, and that's key to our applications. So we're going to talk about where we are now, the challenges that we're having, and then we'll discuss, where we want to go to and how we can get there, and certainly what's in it for me. What are the benefits, not only to the developer, but also to the database administrator, everybody on the dev side, the ops side, and certainly the business. And we're going to leave plenty of time for questions and hopefully some answers. Hopefully, we'll see. But let's kind of talk about where we are now. And, Stephen, Adam, please jump in at any point while we're talking here. But look, I don't think this is any surprise that businesses are innovating very quickly. One could argue they're not innovating as fast as they'd like. But we're getting all sorts of neat tools and processes and procedures and ways of life for getting that code out the door. We're certainly adopting DevOps. We are moving from on-prem to the cloud, whether it's test-driven development or moving to containers. There's all sorts of really groovy stuff out there for our development teams to take advantage of to get leaner, meaner, and faster. Unfortunately, there's a challenge, all right? And it turns out that data has become a new constraint. It is creating risk. It is slowing teams down. And I think the folks that really put a super fine point on this is our friends at DevOps Research and Assessment. So Dr. Nicole Forsgren and her team, they do a survey every single year. And this is the State of DevOps report. They've done it for many, many years, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And this past year, for the 2018 report, they asked about the database. And this was just really eye-opening. This is something that I think, there we go. Sorry about that, folks. I think it was really, it's something that Adam and I certainly felt that the database was important to DevOps. Stephen, I believe, agrees with that. But what Dr. Forsgren did is she did some analysis on this, and she found that folks that brought the database into DevOps had more positive outcomes. Wow, that's great. But what was really interesting about the report is that it said that the database was not differentiated across low, medium, high, and elite IT performers. Now that's fancy dancy statistics talk for everybody can benefit. So you don't have to be a elite IT performer living and breathing DevOps to benefit from addressing this problem. This is something that even if you are an older company with monolithic legacy applications, you can certainly benefit from this. And it was really nice to see somebody, put some research into this and prove that, yes, if you address the database when it comes to DevOps, you're going to have more positive outcomes. Now, we've also heard from Gartner, where they talked to some developers and got their thoughts on how the developers view the data team. Now, this is a slide that DBAs really dislike. And I don't, I can absolutely see why. These are common developer complaints about the data group. The data group's too slow, they offer little value, they're too hard to work with, they don't know they should do so. I mean, this is not a good look. Now, allow me to speak for the DBAs. Of course they're slow because they're constrained by the processes and the procedures that they've been adopted for years and years and years. What we need to do is we need to have a kumbaya moment. We need to have, certainly as DevOps teaches us, we need to bring everybody to the table. We need to bring in our operations folks to work with the development team. And we need to get past this bottleneck. Our companies are not going to reach the level of innovation that our executives want until we solve this problem. And the time is now. If not me, then who? If not now, then when, right? We are getting faster and faster with our releases. But the database releases and getting the production-like data available to our dev and test teams is just not keeping up. So what is happening is that any efficiency gains that we've gotten from DevOps in maybe deploying the application, the compiled bits, it just evaporates if we do not include the database. A herd is only as fast as its slowest member. And right now, anybody that's dealing with the database, whether that's schema changes or stored logic changes, whether it's refreshing dev and test environments with data, whether it's providing mass data so that we can have valid testing without exposing PII. These are the things that are really slowing it down. And we've got to solve these problems if we're going to keep up. The companies that solve this problem, the companies that are able to get past this database bottleneck are going to be the ones to succeed in the future and continue to innovate. And, they're going to see DevOps continue to pay dividends. So, Stephen, I know you've put some thought here, and I think people would much rather hear from you, an uninterested, a third-party observer, right? And what you're seeing.
Yeah. So for those in the audience that haven't heard of RedMonk before, RedMonk is a developer, / practitioner-focused industry analyst firm. So what that means is that when we do our research, we focus on the folks in the field. We focus on the developers, who are producing applications, the DBAs, and sort of data architects, sort of who underlie the persistence mechanisms, of databases of all varying flavors, and sysadmins and ops and lots of other categories we could talk about. And so our sort of lens and sort of the way in which we view the world is very much again sort of practitioner focused. And one of the things that we noticed, I wrote about this about 3 years ago, and had conversations sort of about this maybe 5-6 years ago, was the fact that to the first point here, application development is a set of sort of processes and technologies that have been continually refined, and this has sort of been coupled with to the second point here, essentially the conflation of application development and operations teams, sort of in a, that we all know as DevOps. And, sort of the interesting thing is that, for all of the advances and for all of the improvements that we've made in terms of the speed and velocity with which, sort of we can produce applications, the data side has not kept up its speed. Has not kept up that pace, and that would be a problem sort of in a vacuum. But to the third point here, when you sort of think about and sort of consider the fact that sort of with digital businesses today, either you are incumbent and you're facing essentially challenges from would-be disruptors, or sort of you are one of those would-be disruptors. But the nature of digital business today is very much sort of velocity oriented. We talk a lot about, there's a ton of chatter in the industry about, quote unquote, digital transformation. And, from our perspective at RedMonk, what that boils down to more often than not actually is velocity. Because, sort of in comparison and contrast with conversations we might have had 5 or 6 years ago, when you had lots and lots of enterprises that had no digital presence or limited digital presence. Most of them are online, right? Most of them have digital businesses. The trick isn't getting them sort of onto essentially digital platforms, but the trick is rather helping them operate at the speed and velocity necessary to keep up with essentially digital natives and digital companies that have only known that sort of method of operation. So when you sort of sum all this up, really to the last point here, really what we end up with is a sort of a question, right, that begins coming back from enterprises who sit back and look at this and say, all right, I need to sort of operate at a higher velocity. That is sort of my number one business imperative. I've been able to do that, in terms of the way and method in which I've developed my applications themselves. And indeed, I've made sweeping organizational changes in many cases, sort of driving sort of that DevOps phenomenon home. But the way that I sort of manage my databases, the way that my data operations are conducted, looks a lot like it did 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago in many cases. In spite of the fact that we now have better tooling, we now have sort of a variety of options, both technical, process, and people, to speed that up. So, really, as I said before, I had sort of produced this piece, 3 years ago, I think it was, talking about, a concept that many have sort of referred to as DataOps. And, sort of the very short version when I'm asked about it is, what is that? And essentially, it's the database equivalent of DevOps. And, the way that, you can explain this to enterprises very quickly is, you've made all of these changes on the application development side of the house, to improve your velocity. Why exactly wouldn't you do the same thing, sort of on the database side of the house? And so far, anyhow, no one's had a particularly good answer to that question. And therefore, many of the enterprises and many of the practitioners that we've spoken with have begun examining this question in earnest. And frankly, that's part of the process that ends up with conversations like the one we're having today. So with that backdrop, I will pass it back over to Robert.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it is. I'm very happy to see that this problem is getting looked at by large enterprises because, at a personal level, I just think about all the piano recitals and Little League games and date nights that are getting missed because people are just manually dealing with this problem. They're just throwing bodies at it, or they're just working longer hours. And, there seems to be kind of a tale of two cities thing happening here, where we certainly see over on the application development side of the house that things are getting better. The quality of life is improving for those technical folks. But because that improvement is happening to their quality of life, it's actually decreasing quality of life for the other folks, for the folks that are downstream. And, from a business perspective, that's bad. We have, we're not taking care of all of our technical folks at the company. And given the labor market, that's a really bad thing right now. We've got to work very hard to create the kind of environments that our tech folks want to be a part of. Otherwise, they're just going to move on to a company that does care about those things. If I was an executive, that's, at one of these large companies, it's certainly one of the things I'd be worried about. To that end, let's ask you guys a question.
Okay, let's go ahead and launch this first polling question. What challenges does your team face in accelerating the database deployment process? So you have 5 things to choose from. Lack tools to automate the database deployment process. Database changes not correctly made the first time. Database script reviews take too long. Other, or we don't face any challenges with database deployments. So I'll give everybody a couple seconds here to go ahead and get your answer in. And while we're waiting, do want to remind the audience that at any time, if you have a question for any of our speakers, please just go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. I think we'll have probably around 10 minutes or so near the end of today's presentation to go through audience questions. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and close this out in 3, 2, 1. I'm closing it out and sharing the results here. Looks like the majority of folks say that they lack tools to automate the database deployment process. Robert, I'm sure you have plenty to say about that.
Well, yes.
Sorry.
A little bit. One or two things.
Oh, well, I think it's interesting that the second most popular is the fact that database change is not correctly made the first time. So, how much are we talking about, machine? How much are we talking about human? So sounds like there are issues on both sides there.
Well, sure. I mean, look, let's be honest. I would, let's look at big, failures in recent history with tech. Certainly the S3 outage, was that last year before? That was at AWS. That happened because somebody was manually messed something up. The GitLab production database drop, again, manual. You could argue that, looking at the report that came out of the House committee that looked at the Equifax security breach, the fact that they didn't update Apache struts because it was a manual effort. Everything seems to come back to all these failures manual. And I would argue that because we're asking our database professionals to work longer and harder, and not providing them the tools, the things they need, you're going to get substandard results. That would be my argument. I mean, Stephen, what's your take on that?
Well, I think look, I think with respect to databases, very much as we just talked about, many of the same sort of industry trends that are, underway, shall we say, in application development and other operational settings, right, apply themselves, very much to the database world, right, in the sense that the sort of lack of automation is absolutely a critical, sort of a critical problem. It just goes back to essentially the point that, sort of we had just made, like we've talked about sort of in varying ways over the course of this this particular conversation, is the fact that, too often, the tools and the processes associated with our databases just haven't evolved all that much, right? And in some cases, it's because the infrastructure itself hasn't changed, right? We're still running on the same, in many cases, physical hardware that we've run on for years and years and years. In other cases, the databases themselves have actually moved into sort of cloud environments. It could be a variety of different sort of managed and non-managed type platforms. But the tooling and the processes that have been layered around them, again, just haven't kept pace. Because really one of the things that you see when you look at successful DevOps implementations on the application side is very much the fact that it is not simply a technical problem. There is a set of policies, procedures, cultural elements, including organizational changes that need to keep up. So all of that I think is at play here, right? In the sense that it doesn't surprise me, for example, I mean, yes, we have sort of lack of automation is by far sort of the dominant answer here. But all of these, are problems. All of these are going to be issues, so, except for the 5% that don't have any issues, sort of at all. So, the net is
why,
that.
Why are they here then? Why are they in the webinar?
They're here to learn. They're here to learn. And
all right, I'm going to go.
Go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead and hide the results now so you guys can get back to your conversations.
Okay.
Okay.
So anyhow, the long and the short of that is that I think the results are quite consistent with certainly what we're seeing in the marketplace.
Okay. Well, I think that 5% is here because they want to hear this next part from Adam. They really want to hear what Adam has to say about where do we want to go and how are we going to get there.
Thanks, Robert. And I will say too, for those who answered other on the poll question, I'd be curious if you throw that into the question section. If you wanted to type a little brief statement on what your other was, I'd be curious to see that and know where we didn't hit on the spectrum, just as a piece of curiosity too. So thanks. So so I like the background discussion there from Stephen and from Robert, and also his kind of definition of DataOps as well. And I know here we're talking today specifically kind of around bringing data into the SDLC and the benefits that Dr. Forsgren talked about in her study. But then also too, really what we're talking about here is by and large is systemic of the whole data landscape. And the things that we're going to speak about today, including this next section where I'm speaking, applies not only to the software development lifecycle, but also to your AI and ML initiatives and all the other whole data estate. It's about eliminating that friction around data across the whole data estate. But if you can go to the next slide, Robert, appreciate it. So if we look at, of course, Dr. Forsgren, her and Jez and Jean wrote Accelerate, which we all know and love. And of course, in that, they focus around rapid deployment, continuous integration, continuous deployment. And one of the highlighting studies, or one of the highlighting questions from her study last year, was about not only decreasing risk, but accelerating those deployments. And here what you're seeing on the screen is how many of our customers today are bringing data into their software development lifecycle. And in here, of course, you see, Delphix across the bottom and Datacle on there. But what you see happening from a data perspective is that data is being treated just like we do code. So not only the actual data itself, which we'll talk about in just a second, but the changes to that data and how do we codify those changes and deploy those changes so we can actually have consistency of builds, so we can actually shift quality left. And I think a lot of times people lose sight of what the whole focus of shifting left was. And I hear the phrase shift left testing, and I don't even know what that is really. But I mean, if you shift testing left, that's not a big deal. But if you can shift quality left, then that's a big deal no matter how you do it. And so I like to focus on shifting quality left. And what we see on this slide here is, of course, everybody's familiar with kind of a build pipeline. And so we see developers pushing to Git and Jenkins and pushing code. But by bringing data into the pipeline, like you do application changes, you actually are able to accelerate the whole delivery cycle and in quality. And in this case, in this diagram, what you're seeing is Delphix is connected to your data sources. In a lot of cases for our customers, that's production data sources. So we have many customers out there that are in the Fortune 100, and we connect to their production data sources, and we'll bring that data in and we'll automatically mask it so it's secure. So if the big push right now is on DevSecOps, and we focus a lot on static code analysis and other vulnerability analysis in our code base. But one of the biggest attack vectors and vulnerabilities in our estate is all the data that's left unprotected. Well, one of the best ways to be able to secure your customers or your patients' information from being compromised is to never have it in those lower environments to begin with. And with Delphix, we'll make sure that those lower environments, the data seeded in those lower environments is automatically masked. And so that way, if anybody ever does break into your lower environments, all they've ever stolen is an empty purse. Nothing valuable, no valuable data has been lifted from those environments. But Delphix is able to provision that data to those lower environments in just minutes, which allows you to start with production-like schemas in your lower environments. So what does that actually enable? So now if you're using Delphix in this flow diagram to provision those lower environments with production-like data, then what you can do is you're able to package up those data changes with Datacle, and you're able to deploy those data changes to production-like schemas. So that means no longer are you testing in unit and perhaps integration tests with handcrafted data sets or non-representative data sets, which means that you can introduce breaking changes later. But all the way as early left in the cycle as you wish, you're actually able to test how adding a column or replacing a function or dropping a table would actually affect your production applications and the knock-on effects it would have. And the end result of being able to bring data to the pipeline and being able to provision it and update it just like you do your code when you do your code throughout the pipeline allows you to be able to find those issues early. If we look at the 7 wastes of lean software development, handoffs and delays are big parts of that. If we look at some of the 7 principles of lean software development, amplifying feedback loops is super important. And by amplifying the feedback loops and eliminating delays, we're able to find those issues early. You're able to decrease those costs, obviously, of fixing those issues because you're able to do that in minutes in near real time. And you're also able to accelerate your time to market because you're not pushing quality down the road. This isn't a poll question, but more of a rhetorical question as we talk about the next slide, but how many of you in your environments, there's DevOps for the case of dev, but then there's still a delay when it goes to testing. And the wall of confusion now exists between dev and test, and testing might take weeks and takes a queue up time, and then sometimes features are dropped before ever getting out the window because testing just can't handle the amount of change coming through. I know that I've experienced that with several of my customers, or they've experienced that and shared that with me as well. If we can go to the next one, please, Robert.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Yeah, so of course, here's the wall of confusion, right? So over here to where test automation. Again, going back to Dr. Forsgren's book and Accelerate, test automation is one of the key tenets of being able to truly achieve acceleration in your software development lifecycle. But in many cases, test automation is viewed by many as a like to have. And how many times have I spoken to many customers, and maybe this is representative of you as well, to where you might say, yes, we're doing CI/CD, but all testing is manual. And then I really have to kind of ask, my cheeky question, which is there really anything continuous about that? Which I wrote a blog post about that, continuously interrupted, continuously disappointed. But if you see, the diagram here hasn't changed, right? But you're actually applying this to your test automation to where now in this scenario, you say your developer or whomever pushes to Git, and let's just say you're merging into your master branch, which kicks off your automated testing flow, right? So in this case, now Git does a webhook trigger to Jenkins, and now Jenkins tells Delphix, rebuild my integration data environment with the latest production schema of we'll say you have a composite application in your integration environment of 12 databases, right? And so Jenkins tells Delphix, refresh the data of my integration environment, or reset it to a known good state. And in minutes, automatically, Delphix resets or rewinds that data to the known good state across those 12 different databases. And that happens just in minutes. Then once that data is ready, then Jenkins can proceed with the build. So we'll say you're deploying, a Maven app, a Maven application, and with some database schema changes. And so Jenkins triggers off the Maven build and is deploying the application code. And at the same time, it's triggering Datacl to then to be able to deploy that packaged up SQL changes on top of those integration testing environments. So you're actually testing not just the build process, but you're actually testing the upgrade process, and you're doing it against production-like schemas. And as you continue to iterate this through the various different levels of testing you have, unit, integration, and acceptance testing, what are you actually doing? You're not just testing that the application works, right, which is important, but you're actually also testing your build process. If I look at the DevOps handbook that Gene and Jez and company wrote, and I think John Willis also had a part of it, I don't want to leave anybody off. But if you look at, I think, Chapter 9, in the opening paragraph of Chapter 9 about the fundamentals of a quality build pipeline, it's being able to recreate production at any given point in the stream, and being able to deploy against production-like data, against production-like schemas in a way that's masked, so that way data isn't at risk of your customers, is a huge quality increase to your software development lifecycle stream. And so not only can you increase quality, but you're actually automating the whole deployment of this phase. And again, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but if I was to ask you what's the biggest barrier to testing in your environments, I would be willing to wager a tenor that a lot of it has to do with the data and provisioning of the data, sharing of data, or the orchestrating of data changes around that. Otherwise, you would do more tests and higher quality tests. And of course, we realized by being able to increase the fidelity of the data in those environments, we'll also reduce the production-related issues to those. And one of my particular customers, that's a large mortgage underwriter in the United States, they had found when we came into them, or when we first started speaking to them, the reason they reached out to Delphix was, and Datacl, was because they determined 15% of their production defects were just related to the data they were using in testing, because they were subsetting when they shouldn't have been. Their data was old and stale. It didn't match production, and that matriculated into production-related issues. Good side of the story is they, after treating it with some Delphix and Datacl, they were able to get all production issues that were related to data to less than 5%, which was great news, like 75% reduction in those data-related defects. But it's the same type of scenario. It's exactly the same way in the pipeline. It's just a matter of how you apply it and you use it. Next slide, please, Robert. And then here's another one that most of our customers find and leverage Delphix and Datacl for. It's not at the end. It's not what they originally buy us for, but I have no shortage of examples to give where, look, if you have Delphix connected already in your value stream and it's providing lower environments, it's synced with production, able to provide mass copies of production whenever you need to, on demand through self-service or via an API, and Datacl was able to apply those changes, then what happens, to give you a hypothetical scenario, I know it wouldn't happen to anybody listening on this call because we're all consummate professionals, but let's say that you're a developer and you're working for a large entertainment company, and then you're working on the video on demand product, and you're going to drop all the tables in development so that way you can push your changes to that. And you do that, but then you realize everybody's running around screaming, and sooner or later you realize that you actually did that to production and not development. Well, again, I know that wouldn't happen to anybody on this call, but the funny thing is you pay a lot of money for that active data guard or other sort of active replication, and there's nothing wrong with dropping a table. That's completely logical. So that gets replicated to all your backups or to all your hot standbys. And then what happens is you have to then try and go to backups. Or in this case, if you're using this situation we're describing here, you're able to quickly spin up a copy of production. You don't want it masked in this case because you want the real data, but you're able to spin up a copy of production in minutes and then export that video on demand table out of that copy, and then import that into production to be able to quickly restore service, which is an actual use case from a number of our customers. I'm hearing noise on the line. Is that a question or is it just background noise? Okay, maybe it's just background noise. And then I think we got one more slide. Is that right, Robert? Oh, poll question. I'll turn it back.
We've got a poll question. Okay, guys, here's the second of 3 polls that we're going to be pushing out to you guys. So here it comes. Has your team ever experienced production issues due to database change errors? Easy peasy, yes or no? I'll give you guys a few seconds to go ahead and make your decision. And then again, while we're waiting, just want to remind the audience, if you have a question, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. And we've gotten some good questions in so far, but still would love to see what's on your mind. So go ahead and get your questions in. Excuse me. Okay, we'll go ahead and close out the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're closing and taking a look at the results. Well, I don't think that there's any debate as to the answer of this one. Looks like the majority of folks have experienced production issues due to database change errors. So
90% of our attendees tell the truth, and 10% of our attendees are
so
that's good.
Like it.
Good.
Well played.
all right, I think this one is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to go ahead and hide the results now so you guys can get on with the conversation.
Thank you. So, you know, here, let me get back to this. So look, what do we get out of this? I mean, yeah, we're okay. We're not having errors in production. You know, we don't have automation tools, but we're getting by manually. I mean, is the juice worth the squeeze? And you know, I really want to kind of open this up, you know, to you know, certainly have Stephen and Adam weigh in here on what do we get out of it. But you know, just for my money, I think the most interesting thing here is more at bats. You know, certainly faster development and faster time to market. When we eliminate these wait states and we're able to provision dev and test environments as quickly as we're able to for application containers, we're able to get software at the door faster. We're able to experiment more. You know, look, if you have, you know, let's say 1 out of 10, you got a 10% chance of hitting a home run. You know, wouldn't you want to put out 10 releases and experiment and see what happens? But if you're only able to get 1 release out a quarter or 1 a month, it's going to take you 10 months to get a home run. Wouldn't it be cool to get like 1 home run a day if we're able to do 10 releases a day? You know, that's where I think this goes. Eliminating those wait states and having more experimentation. I mean, Stephen, Adam, what do you see companies getting out of by eliminating these bottlenecks?
I think honestly all of the above. I think the one that tends to be sort of most appreciated from the business side of the house, you know, is the, you know, as we talked about at the top, the improved velocity, right? You know, as far as this chart goes, faster development, faster time to market. But you know, depending on sort of, you know, sort of the needs and perspectives of the organization, you know, the priority could very well be, you know, something like reduction of risk, right? You know, we talked about some of the failures from dropped, you know, sort of databases, you know, due to manual processes, you know, sort of earlier. So, you know, really, I think it varies by organization. I think the net is that it is, you know, as we've seen, you know, sort of in other areas, you know, application development, which we've talked about, operations, we haven't talked as much about, you know, basically the introduction of automated processes, you know, from end to end, you know, can do a variety of good, right? It can do, you know, can obviously help with speed, it can help with quality, it can reduce risk, you know, reduce sort of the sort of possibility of downtime from errors, collateral damage, you know, sort of, et cetera. So, Yeah, I mean, I guess the short version is that I would sort of second all of this. You know, the one I would say that comes up most frequently in conversations we have, as I said, is the essentially the concept of velocity.
Yeah, and so from my perspective, it's interesting. I agree with Stephen. But one of the biggest barriers to actually velocity, if we think about this, you know, why is there all of a sudden, I call it kind of you know, a cloud redivivus, right? So, you know, cloud, you know, there was the kind of big cloud craze back in the day, but even now inside of the financial services companies in the last, let's say 12 to 16 months, maybe closer to 12 months, I've really seen now where we're talking about big, like 4-letter named banks that are truly in on actual leveraging hybrid cloud, AWS and Azure, and putting their products up there, whereas before cloud meant to them like another data center or something else internally only. But why I bring that up is because the biggest barrier for them to going to the cloud was data security. But why do they want to go to the cloud? It's because they want to have a faster time to market. They want to leverage all the bells and whistles and toys in ephemeral environments, cost optimizations, etc. But why don't they go? It's because of the surface area of risk. For some reason, in their mind at least, the cloud was less secure, right? Though, you know, if you've worked in any of these organizations, you realize that their data centers, by and large, have so many holes in them. It's like Swiss cheese in terms from a security perspective. And the cloud would be, you know, probably a better, more security angle. But the thing is if you look at the approach that we applied, showing in that document in the slides earlier, if you're using something like Delphix, which automatically syncs from production and masks the data for any downstream environment to use, Delphix actually helps in our customers, like these 4-letter banks, actually allows them to connect to those production data sources and only replicate the masked bits up to the cloud or to any lower environments, even offshoring. So that reduces that surface area of risk. And then if you actually can put secure, sanitized data in those environments, so where there's no data risk, that actually unlocks everything else. That unlocks your cloud migration projects. It allows you to place the data up there, and data has a gravity around it. And wherever the data is, that's where people are going to build their toys. They're going to build their applications. They're going to build their products. And guess what? I'm not the only one who knows this. This is why Oracle, Amazon, and Google and Azure, they all make that storage super cheap, because they want you to store stuff there. Because wherever you store your data, that's where you're going to build all your toys around. And then they're going to get you for all the toys that you build around that data. So from our perspective, we see kind of that risk is inhibiting them unlocking all those things that they want to use. But when they're able to replicate and only send secured or mass data up to their cloud of choice, then they're able to use all these other widgets around it that allows them to have faster development times and automate all their tools and stuff in it. So it's kind of almost a quid pro quo from the data perspective.
Well, cool. Well, I think we got one more poll question here.
We do have one more poll question, which I'm going to be pushing out right now. Would increased automation in the database deployment process have the potential to accelerate overall application release cycle? ? Select one of the following, yes or no. Again, stupid simple yes or no question. We'll give you guys a couple seconds here to submit your answer. And just keep in mind, guys, at the end of today's presentation, we're going to be doing that drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So stick around, and hopefully you'll be one of our big winners. So
must be present to win.
That's right. Must be present to win. Not even in spirit, but actually physically present. So, okay, we're going to go ahead and close it out in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and whoop, hold on. There we go. Okay, there are the results. Okay, it looks like the majority of folks said yes. Increased automation would have helped. So what do you guys think?
I think 82% of the people are correct.
Yeah, this is pretty much a right or wrong answer.
Okay, nobody said that this would actually be a test. They were just polling questions. All right, we're about quarter to the top of the hour, so I'm going to shut up and let you guys finish up.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much. So now we're going to open it up for questions. And also, we certainly have a white paper for you guys to download and check out, where we go a little bit more into this topic. But at this point, let's answer some questions.
Yeah, we've gotten some good ones in so far, so let's go ahead and dive right on in. But before I do, just a quick reminder, if you do have a question, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. We have about at least 10 minutes or so that we can get through some questions. So here's the first one. How does the volume of data impact this process, i.e. tables with billions of rows? And do you dev and test against a subset of production?
So yeah, so maybe I'll jump in and take this. Look, I think one of the interesting I guess observations that I've made being in tackling this problem in the last 5+ years at Delphix is I've seen everybody try every manner of thing to get around data being hard, and that's how I just qualify. Data is hard, right? To get it right is hard. Everything else is easy, but to get it right is hard. And so when you asked me the subset question, here's how I'll answer, because that's kind of like how long is a piece of string, and that is I think there's a lot of people that, because data is so large, unwieldy, or because, like the poll saw earlier, because they think the data group is, really a blocker to them, et cetera, then they might use subsetting or pure synthetic data just to try and work around a constraint, right? And so if we follow DevOps methodologies, and going back, earlier to Goldratt's theory of constraints, unless we're actually tackling the real constraint, we're just deceiving ourselves or creating an illusion that we're going faster. And so I see a lot of people using subsetting just because data's too big to move around or too hard to secure, et cetera. And actually, that one customer I mentioned earlier that had the 15% related defects, the defects that they had and were so prevalent in production was because they were using subsetting to fix everything. And like they say, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That being said, let me just be clear here. I'm not bashing subsetting at all, because I think there's a valid point in time for people to use that. So, but what the point is I want to make to answer this question is that from Delphix perspective, I want you to be able to use whatever data is the most fit for purpose. And I want to eliminate the constraints around that. So if you're developing in a sandbox and you need just a 1% data set because the query you're writing on your MacBook couldn't possibly return in less than 3 hours against 3 terabytes of data, then I think it makes sense to use that 1% subset. And I want Delphix to be able to provide that for you with just an automatic API call or a self-service interface of some sort. And the same breadth, right, is that if you then ship that code and you're now onto we'll say functional or system or integration testing, where a larger, more representative data set is needed, I want you to be able to use the same kind of mechanism and get it just as easily to where you need it. Do you want the 50% subset? Do you need a full subset? Do you need, you have a composite application, so you need 7 or 8 data sets in sync together from the same point in time? I want it to be that easy for you to leverage that data to be able to do that there. So I don't like to ask it's a more philosophical question of just subsetting data. Does it help me deliver faster and higher quality software? That's kind of your own usage. But what I do want to get away from is trying to use subsetting to satisfy a constraint that might not otherwise exist. And I just want you to use the right data at the right time. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that yourself, Robert.
No, I mean, from Datacl's perspective, I mean, the size of the database never really matters. I mean, whether we're pointing, because we're changing the structure, the schema, certainly if you're, an older database, as you create a column with a default value set, you could lead to a DML lock. And if it's a big table, that's a problem. But we have a rules engine to prevent that stuff. So it's really the size of the data doesn't really impact us. But certainly that's why we're partnered with you guys, because you solve that problem.
Yeah, and just to be clear too, in case, just to cover the other angle of it, from a Delphix perspective, the size of the database doesn't really matter to us either. We have, I did a webinar with Gene Kim 2 years ago, and I provisioned 6 3-terabyte databases simultaneously in AWS, and they were all up and running in 3 minutes. And I was commenting about 2.5 minutes in that I thought it was taking too long, to which Gene laughed at me. But I have customers also doing like 45 terabyte databases, and they're up and ready to use from the time they say I want it inside of 15 minutes automatically, right? So from a Delphix perspective, the size of data doesn't matter. But again, depending on what you're doing, it might behoove you to have a smaller subset of data and still leverage your same subsetting or synthetic technologies you use today against the virtual data Delphix can provide.
All right, great. So let's move along to the next question here. How do you automate the database code regression testing, e.g. PL/SQL or T-SQL?
Well, automating, so for example, we've got a stored procedure that we need to test. Look, something's calling that, and that's the application, and you've got tests for that. I think these things, the application needs to be tested holistically. Certainly we can have unit tests for specific parts of the database. But look, all that testing doesn't matter unless you have the environment created. And I think with Delphix being able to create those virtual databases and Datacle pointing against it to update it, to the testing, the release that you're testing, that solves that problem. You need to be able to create these environments correctly and get them to the proper state. Because if they are not, if you are testing against something that kind of sort of looks like production, well, you're kind of sort of going to get a valid test result. And so my argument would be that it's environment creation and testing holistically is going to help you really see if that change to stored procedure or something like that is going to break your application.
All right, great. Looks like we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Is it the best strategy in banking finance to use massed production for testing? And does synthetic data make any sense if mass data is cheap to obtain?
Yeah, I'll take that, and I'm also going to combine it with another question that's similar that asks, how can you handle edge cases not represented in the production code? Can you obfuscate production and then add canned edge case data too? Because they're both in the same vein. So I tell you, like all of our customers, the majority of our largest customers are all banking, finance, insurance, same type of heavily regulated PCI, PII style data, and ultimately, yes. I mean, if you have mass production data, I mean, that should cover majority of your testing cases. But look, like is already evident there, you might have you want to do your edge cases, right? You have testing suite software that helps you cover your edge cases that create synthetic data. There might be you might be doing net new creation. So a new application, part of your composite application, doesn't have any data yet. So what do you use for that? You got to create synthetic data. So the good news is on this is I'm sure from the 2 people who asked the question, you probably have synthetic tools that create that data today. The data that get from Delphix, we can mass production, and then that data is fully read-write. It's just like anything else. And there's actually, if you go to I actually put out a blog or a video blog showing this in kind of in action with Delphix and Datacle called a test data catalog, effectively, where I go through and I take production, I mass copy production, I use some subsetting tools against that data to create subsets. I use synthetic data creation tools to add synthetic data where I need it for my application. And then Delphix is able to just create a catalog of entries for those, so you can use the data you need to when you want to. So to answer those questions emphatically, yes, yes, yes. We can mass production data. You can add synthetic data you need to for the testing. You can subset those data sets if you want to. You can touch it, feel it, create it just like you can normal data. But what actually goes away, as we talked about in this thing, is the handoffs, the cycle time, the manual copy, backup, restore, and you give the developers, testers, whomever, or Jenkins, as you saw in the flow, the automatic ability to be able to refresh that data from a point in time that they need to, or reset that data if they did a destructive test so it's ready to go again in minutes. No tickets, no waiting, no handoff, no delays, and avoiding the cardinal sins of Agile.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. What can be done to help DBAs get developers on board with database release automation?
Good question.
Refuse to make changes. No, seriously. DBAs, where I've seen this most successful is where the database administrators over in production are frankly, they're being treated like elementary school janitors, just cleaning up after, walking around with bags of sawdust, clean up developer throw up. It's not cool. It's unacceptable. It's not good for the business. It's not good for the developers or the DBA. And so there needs to be a change from the database administrators to say, look, we're going to give, and we're going to take. We're going to give you the opportunity to make these changes yourself. But what we're going to take from you is that you have to follow this process, this procedure. So if you have database release automation and you're having a difficult time getting the developers to use it, you need to change the process and say, look, you're going to use this tool if you want your changes out. And so that is the new procedure. It's no longer file a ticket and attach a SQL script. They have to use this tool if they want their change out. Now, of course, you have to go to an executive. You have to go to a leader. And that previous slide where we were talking about the benefits, going to that development leader, that executive, and say, look, you're not happy with the pace of the release to production, are you? No, I'm not. I wish it would be faster. Great. This is a way to get faster, but we're going to need your team to push the button. We're going to need your team to, use this tool, this infrastructure we've set up, if they want those changes to happen. And of course, if they refuse, well, you can go up to where the development leader and the operations leader eventually report into one person and go talk to that person. Because I guarantee you that C-level exec is really concerned about the pace at which application change is happening in production.
All right, great. Well, we're about 2 minutes to the top of the hour, so we're going to have to close out the question and answer period. Do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. If we didn't get to your questions, just know that the folks at Datacol will be getting a copy of all of the audience questions, and so I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. And I promised you a drawing at the beginning of today's webinar, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right on in to find our 3 $50 Amazon gift card winners. Our first winner is Kelly Woods. Congratulations, Kelly.
Hey, Kelly.
Yay, Kelly. Yay. Second winner, Israel Lamont. Congratulations, Israel.
Israel.
Yeah. And our final winner is Scott Beery. Congratulations, Scott.
Scott. Nailed it.
All right. Okay, well, thank you to everybody who attended today's webinar. I want to remind everybody that today's webinar has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to listen to it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out an email later on this afternoon that will contain a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. So you can always go there, check it out. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And while you're there, please check out the other webinars that we have both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be a couple that pique your interest. Stephen, Adam, and Robert, thank you guys for such a great presentation. I know, judging by the questions we got, I know the audience got a lot out of it. So thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. It's top of the hour. So this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.